Once again, just to remind everybody here that this is a very selfish exercise. This is me trying to figure out and understand my own life a little bit by talking to you. So once again, Donna, I thank you for this opportunity. If you remember, the first installment sort of went through my love at first sight with theater when I saw the theater festival, the student theater festivals in Zagreb, in what was then Yugoslavia, came back to McGill, ran the McGill Players Club, and then thanks to one of my professors in the German department, I got a job as an intern and then was hired as an assistant director at the Schiller Theater, which is, I think, the biggest theater in the world. And I went to Berlin because I wanted to see the plays of Brecht. Brecht being at the time the man for me in the theater. He mixed entertainment and politics. And this was, after all, the 70s, and it was a highly political time. So I stayed there for a year and then went to London and started the Half Moon Theatre, which opened on January 27th, 1972. So that's where we essentially stopped. And I really want to pick it up from there. And I'm sorry, Donna, we may not get to what you think is the juicy bits of Canadian theatre, but I'm just going to plow on. But there are three stories that in that first summation I missed that I think are important to understand from my point of view. So the first was that, if you remember, that until I was 17, I was going to follow my father into the military. He signed up in Winnipeg during the war, a Western regiment. His regiment was the PPCLI, that's the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry. And anybody who knows the military knows that the regiment is your home, it's the regimental pride, and that was his regiment. In fact, my kid sister, her first name is actually Patricia. So after the hijacking of the Canadian stage, and we'll get to there eventually, I was freelancing again. So I had to do it. This was in 1990. I had to do gigs, for anybody and everybody, including CBC Radio, directing radio drama. Anybody remember that era when they had plays on radio? Wasn't that a magical time? Why aren't they doing it now during COVID? Where's the CBC? Who's running the CBC? Give us some more Canadian drama on radio. Anyway, I pitched the CBC a docudrama on the airborne atrocities in Somalia. They bought it, and I went to Petawawa and followed the court-martials. And it was at that time I realized that the regiment that was involved was the PPCLI, my father's regiment. They were the guys who were committing the racist atrocities on a so-called peacekeeping mission. I'm sure some of you will remember 93, 94, the scandal that went through the Canadian military at the time. It turned out that that elements of this company of the PPCLI were actually enticing Black kids into the compound and then beating the shit out of them in front of other soldiers. So I actually got quite deeply into that story and wrote a docudrama that I directed and narrated for the CBC, but I wrote it here where I am now, which is actually my parents' former place. And my father, knowing it was his regiment I was writing about. So those were some interesting moments between father and son at the time. And he was always silent. Of course, that activity was beyond his imagining. That's, not the kind of military he thought he had joined. And then in May 1995, Jean Chrétien disbanded the Airborne. Anyway, that's one story I missed. The other second story is a McGill story, and it's kind of fun. In the summer of '69, I started a semi-professional theater company in Moyes Hall. I called it Theater 15 in honor of the Compagnie des Quinze, a company formed in 1930 by Michel Saint-Denis. Now, to be honest, I had at the time no idea who Compagnie des Quinze and Jacques Copeau. I'm not really sure who they were, but I did know that Michel Saint-Denis had founded the National Theatre School. In fact, at the time, I was sort of sneaking in and catching classes on lighting and so on, and I hung around with a lot of the students. So after having run the McGill Players for that year. I had the resources, and I got, believe it or not, the McGill Alumni Society to fund the idea of a semi-professional company in Moyes Hall. They were doing this because it was 1 year away from the McGill sesquicentennial, and they wanted a theater company then, and so we were kind of like a dress rehearsal for them. So there I was in the office of the treasurer of the McGill Alumni Society, and we'd agreed that they were going to sponsor the company with $5,000. I had no bank account. The theater company had no bank account, and he looks at me and he opens the safe and he gives me 5 $1,000 bills that I have in my hand, and I'm walking down University Street. Floating is probably a better way to describe it. And I put it in my own bank account, and it basically financed 5 plays in Moyes Hall that summer, including a play, what I believe was the North American premiere of Pinter's The Homecoming. Now, at that time, somebody approached me, and the lighting designer of the company said, well, there's this American actor who was doing something at La Ronde, and that show happened to, went bankrupt, and he's in town, he doesn't know what to do, let's hire him. So I hired him. It was David Mamet. So David Mamet, before he was the David Mamet of the Pulitzer Prize winning playwright, he was an actor, not a particularly good one. He played Lenny, the pimp in The Homecoming, and his Cockney accent left a little to be desired. But the sequel, of course, is that after getting to knowing him then as the producer of that theater company, by the way. Again, so many alumni of that company have gone on. Michael Mawson was in the company. Elsa Bolam actually directed a show for us. She directed Loot, Joe Orton. Really good production that she did, actually. And there were Dixie Seedle and Fiona was in it, and it was an incredible. In fact, working as a publicist was a guy called Laszlo Barna, who later founded Barna Opera Productions, a really important left-wing sort of union-based documentary and filmmaker who went on to do a lot of good work for CBC. So there was, as I kept saying, that energy at McGill. Anyway, David Mamet, the sequel was that 20 years ago in 1999-20, he was shooting a film here, a film called The Heist, which he shot here in Montreal. He was shooting Montreal for New York, I guess, and Boston. Anyway, with Gene Hackman, Delroy Lindo, and Danny DeVito, and a couple of others. And so there was a small part that needed a German accent. So I did my German accent for him. And sure enough, he remembered me and gave me a small part in the film. And I got to play a scene with Gene Hackman. In fact, I was hired by the film company to teach Gene German because he wanted to play the scene in German. So I spent a couple of hours with Gene teaching him the lines in German. And of course, when we actually got to shoot it, he couldn't remember anything. So we did it all in English. But he was a strange man, generous, but also very suspicious. And I have to say that Mr. Mamet was not very well liked by the cast as a director. It was a funny experience because David would shout action and then he would retire and lie on the tarmac. We were shooting it up at the airport in North Montreal and Mirabel, and he was doing his money deals while we were playing the scene. He wasn't even looking at the monitors. He was doing his money deals for his next film. Anyway, that was the second a little story I wanted to do catch up on. And the third one is the financing of the Half Moon in London. I told you the story about how we ripped lead off of roofs and then fenced it the next morning, 65 shillings a hundredweight, in order to finance my production of In the Jungle of the Cities by Bertolt Brecht, which opened the Half Moon Theatre. But it wasn't quite true. There was another funder, and to that I have to go back to McGill again. And here I am in '69, living in a loft in Old Montreal. Oh my God, those were the days when you could actually afford them. Right on Place Royale, I'm on the top floor. And one night, we had great parties there. Anyway, I won't go into that side, but those were the late '60s. And I hear this voice, hello, anybody up there? I mean, even deeper than my voice. And then clump, 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 clump. Somebody's coming up the stairs, and it's Donald Sutherland. And Donald he's shooting a film in Montreal. The film company's put him in the loft just below mine. I think he asked for a loft, but his phone hasn't been hooked up yet, so he needs a phone. So he said, can I use your phone? I said, I have to phone my wife in LA. So he's phoning Shirley Douglas, right? The daughter of Tommy Douglas, our great Canadian savior, hero, because at the time they were married. In fact, Kiefer Sutherland was already born, and Donald had started to get a certain international renown. He'd done The Dirty Dozen, and he was shooting this Canadian film, also starring Geneviève Bujold, directed by Paul Almond. Anyhow, so he's on the phone with Shirley, because she's been put in prison in Los Angeles because she had started a charity raising funds for the Black Panthers. And of course, the FBI didn't like that. So what they do, they planted some illegal explosives in her house and then arrested her. Initially, she was sentenced to jail. And then on the retrial, the judge threw the whole thing out when they found out that in fact, the FBI had fitted her up. But I think that ruined her career in the States. Anyway, so then that became a beginning of a friendship with Donald. And he was quite taken by my girlfriend at the time that I've told you about, this stunning Hungarian gypsy. We were together quite a while, and then we actually got married. We were married less time than we were together, but we really at the time we were together and believed in the same things politically as well, and so there we were, these radical student theater people, and Donald took a shine to us. He even invited us at one point when he was shooting the film Clute with Jane Fonda. He invited us to New York. He was shooting in the middle of Harlem, and we had lunch. So my partner and I and Donald and Jane, the four of us had lunch in a restaurant in Harlem, and Jane was in her fitness radicalness time, and we were supposed to feed. So there we are in this Harlem restaurant. Jane is talking to us, and she's soaking in, these radical students from Montreal and enjoying it all. Of course, she's also on her health kick. So she looks at the menu. There's nothing there for her to eat. So she orders an orange, and of course the restaurant didn't have an orange. So they had some poor waiter had to run down the street, buy an orange for her. But those again were kind of amazing days. At one point, actually, I was in a hotel room with Donald. There was a script lying there, and it had MASH on it. And I picked it up and I started reading and making fun. I thought it was a pretty terrible script. And he said, "Guy, don't. I have to play the part." And then it became, of course, the third largest grossing film of that year. Anyway, so Donald, when I started the Half Moon, this was the whole point of the story, he actually gave us 500 pounds. And so was a major contributor to the beginning of the Half Moon. There's actually another story that I think might be, because it sets the mood. I want to get to the Half Moon. I want to talk about community theater and the politics of that, and I want to talk about directing, the difference between continental directors and British directors. So that was the period of the Half Moon. Now, when I was in London, of course, if you remember, I had been writing for the Toronto Star, so I had a press card. So with the press card, I actually got access to a rehearsal at the Berliner Ensemble, Brecht's theater, and I had one afternoon where I got to watch a rehearsal. Now, what you have to imagine is in the rehearsal, it was Eckhard Schall, who's the star, the son-in-law of Brecht himself. Brecht, of course, long dead, but Helene Weigel is still running the theater. The Grande Dame, she was always the CEO of the theater. Brecht was actually only her employee, believe it or not. Anyway, so there's the technician row, there's the makeup row, there's the lighting row. They all have their production tables, and everybody's in white lab coats. You really think you're in this scientific examination of theater. And there's the actor on stage, and he's acting away, and you can see that the costume people are discussing something, and at one point one guy gets up, runs up in the middle of the whole scene, goes up to the lead actor and rips his mustache off. The actor doesn't stop for a second, carries right on acting, and the costume guy goes back, and then you can see them discussing it with their white lab coats on behind the table, and they think, yeah, it's better without the mustache, so they just keep letting him act. But then in walks Helene Weigel to see how the rehearsals are going. And I'm there, and of course, I want to meet her. And she basically snubs me, walks by. She just says, "Lesen Sie Brecht," read Brecht, goes and deliberately sits right behind one of the rows of the technicians and just gently waves her hand like this. They all stand up and run out of the way so that she has a better view. So that's the hierarchy of a European, maybe a German, maybe not, maybe less French, I don't know, but certainly in the Russian and German theater culture. That's the hierarchy that happens. Actually, at the Schiller, when I was there, there were a couple of actors from Brecht's company who would come over from the East. And when I asked them, I said, "So what's this alienation, Verfremdung? What's this technique all about? How do you do it?" And they said, "Ach, guy, spiel so einfach so wie du spielst. Just play exactly the way them. Nobody gives a damn." So to them, all of this theorizing of the alienation effect of Brecht they just got on with their acting. And when I think how many academic papers have been written about the theory of alienation in acting, and really all it is about is good acting. So that was Helene Weigel, the Schiffbauer. And I'm sorry, I'm going to jump with one more story before we get to the Half Moon. One of the plays I was assisted on at the Schiller Theatre was a play called Murderous Angels by Conor Cruise O'Brien. Now, Conor Cruise was the left wing. He was a member of the Dáil in Ireland, and I think had something to do with the UN at one point. So he wrote this play about the Lumumba Crisis. Now, if you remember, what happened is that when Patrice Lumumba was elected, he was a communist, member of the Communist Party, to be the president of Congo. Basically, he was going to nationalize all of the resources of that country. And Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the Swedish General Secretary of the United Nations, he was very much in favor and supported him. And so what happened is the CIA, in conjunction with Belgian mining interests, got together and essentially assassinated both of them. So Conor Cruise O'Brien had written this quite decent play, and the theater, which was, if you remember, a kind of a well-known center of sort of fascist sentiment during the war, the Schiller Theater, invited Karl Parulla, who was this left-wing Jewish actor-director who had survived the war by acting in Switzerland, to come and direct it. So they were trying to, in many ways, I don't know, reparations or something. So Karl comes and he's directing this left-wing play and I'm his assistant director. Now, I represent the other world. I'm the non-German in the room. I had long hair. Some of the senior actors in the hallway would scream at me because I was quite shy, but I had long hair, so I was the enemy, and they would shout at me, "Hier im Hause grüßt man sich." In our theater, you say hello. And I would basically didn't say hello because I was too intimidated. But anyway, Carl and I were ended up great friends. But the actor playing Hammersholt was one of the old guard with a little bit, some leanings towards the right still. And at one point he resigned the part. And there's Karl Paryla in the middle of this huge theater having a meltdown. Dieses Faschistentheater, dieses braunes Theater, this fascist theater, this brown theater. And then the biggest insult of all was this Karl Zuckmayer theater, who was the playwright that they played during the war. Remember, it's just 25 years after the end of the Second World War. I mean, I've been running Infinite Theater for 20 years, so it's barely the same amount of period. All of the energies and the politics and so on are still gestating in this huge theater. Carl, at the time, I had bought a secondhand Volkswagen from the Berlin Fire Department, and Karl Paryla had this really ritzy white. I mean, artists in Germany were paid well, especially stars like Mr. Paryla. And he had a mistress who was an opera singer, and so he couldn't drive his very well-known, high-class white Mercedes to his rendezvous with his mistress. Because his wife was in the hotel right next door. So he would pay me a couple of marks, 10 marks and so on, and I would drive him in my little beaten up Volkswagen to his rendezvous with his mistress. Anyway, I'm sorry. Those are just fun stories. Now we're back to January 27th, 1972, finally. The opening of The Jungle of the Cities at the Half Moon Theater. Remember, I was this Canadian Andy Hardy. Hey, let's build a theater. We can do it. I wanted to do a Brecht. At the time, Equity allowed the senior actors even to work for a cut of the box in London because it was a showcasing. So I ended up with a fabulous cast in of actors in that play. In fact, one of the actors was an actor by the name of Will Knightley, and I only twigged recently. He was a highly respected theater and senior and film actor in England, and I only twigged recently Will Knightley, Keira Knightley. Yes, he's the father of Keira Knightley. So I go to Will's, Facebook page or whatever, and there he is, really proudly announcing that he was one of the founding members of the Half Moon. Anyway, the reviews for In the Jungle of the Cities, Brecht's third play, he had not yet seen the political left light, as it were. A chaotic play that basically poeticized the relationship between Rimbaud and Verlaine, but an absolutely, such imagination and such language. It's extraordinary. We do not understand Brecht in English or French because the strength of Bertolt Brecht is his writing. And he captures poetry in the German language in a way that we can't when we translate it. Something like in Mother Courage, he created a dialect as if it was a Southern German dialect for the central character, for the characters, but he did it with a poetic kind of ear. And there's no way that we can understand or mirror that when we do the translations. Anyway, the reviews were great. They all said, at the same time, Vanessa Redgrave was in a revival of Threepenny Opera in the West End. And and the actors and the reviews all said, listen, if you want to see a real Brecht, go down to the Half Moon and catch Jungle. So we were on the map. There we were. We had this small theater, seated only 100 on the old pews from the synagogue. It was a thrust theater, sort of 3/4 round. And now what do we do? Well, here's this weird juxtaposition. You have this Canadian who wants to build a community theater. I'm in the East End, in the working class part of London. And I think we should build a community theater. There were Morris Colburn was the actor who was living in the synagogue at the time. He was an actor, a really good actor. He wasn't really into politics. He just wanted to do some good acting. So, and then eventually, in fact, he was discovered. People came down to the Half Moon, and then he eventually got a lead in a BBC series, and he was sort of a Sean Connery stature and voice, and had that kind of that kind of presence. And so I was left essentially after about a year. I was left as the first full artistic director. But my first sort of gambit in trying to make this into a community theater was that I discovered that that the final confrontation between Richard II and John Ball and Wat Tyler in the 1381 Peasants Uprising actually happened in the Mile End, in London's Mile End. It happened just sort of half a mile from where we were. The East End that we're in, by the way, was also extremely close to the Shakespearean theaters, the Curtain and the theater itself. They're almost just a stone's throw from where the synagogue was that became the Half Moon. Anyway, so we had history on our side, as it were. So I spent a lot of time researching the Peasants Uprising of 1381 in the British Library. Tried to sit in Karl Marx's chair as much as I could, which wasn't very often free. Everybody else wanted to sit there as well. So and then we pulled together a cast of 10. I'm going to just take a little before we get to that show. One of the things that, of course, now that the theater was a going concern, I was living in a bedsitter at £1 a week in Shepherd's Bush. Took 45 minutes, but also was expensive to get to the theater. At the time, the squatters movement was starting strong in the East End. And the situation in London at the time is that you had hundreds of thousands of homeless people, and you had hundreds of thousands, literally, of empty abodes. And the reason is that there was this ancient law in the books that, my home is my castle. And in order to evict anybody, you had to go through the legal process. So you could be living in a place, and as long as you were living there, the police could not kick you out, even if you didn't have a lease, if you didn't have a rent, or didn't anything. The owner of that building had to go to court and then get an eviction notice before, in fact, you got kicked out. So the squatting movement, and the reason why there were so many empty rooms is because of that law. So many empty abodes and houses, and so you had these real estate developers trying to collect all these empty houses so they could pull them down and put up high rises and so on. So just 5 minutes walk from the theater, there was a street, Parfitt Street, with a number of empty places. And so one night at midnight, I broke in the back, threw in a mattress and food and seats and lights and whatever. And the next morning, sure enough, the neighbors called the police. The police came to the door, and he said, "Excuse me, sir, what are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm living here." And he said, "Oh, fine, thank you very much." Tipped his hat, and that was it. So we were living in this empty house right near the theater, and became part of a very well-organized squatting movement in the East End of London. and thank God, because like I say, I just didn't have the money to live anywhere. Eventually, this is jumping ahead a year here, but eventually the real estate firm did go to court and take us to court. But we had some left-wing lawyers who were working pro bono, and they said, "What? You know, wait a second. What do they want to do with this? They have no plans. Why are they kicking us out?" And the judge at the time, and we were now starting to get sort of national renown with this whole battle, and the judge at the time said, "You know what? You guys are right. I'm not going to give the eviction notice until the developers come and tell me what exactly they're going to do with this." So it all started over again. And then eventually they came with a plan, and the judge said, "All right, give you the eviction notice." The problem was the owners weren't too smart, and they told us exactly when the bailiffs were going to come to evict us. So naturally, we had 200 people in front of our homes, and the bailiffs couldn't come and couldn't kick us out. And so then they wouldn't tell us. So now we became, you know, we were in the front pages of the newspapers now, because we barricaded ourselves in to get in and out of our houses. You had to go through the first floor window with a ladder and so on. So you knock on the door and they drop a ladder and you climb in. Anyway, eventually we found out when they were coming again, and we had TV crews and radio crews and so on inside, you know, capturing the axes, breaking down the doors, but in the meantime, I had already liberated a house just 4 doors away. So the bailiffs put all of our furniture in the street, and our supporters just carried the furniture 4 doors away, put it back in the house, and the whole legal process had to start over again. The owners that night put dogs in all of the empty houses that they'd kicked, where people they'd kicked out, and we got our supporters together and broke back into the houses. We had some dog handlers. They took the dog handlers, leashed them to the telephone pole, and then phoned the police and said, "Hey, these dogs have got escaped. Could you please? They're danger. Could you please take them away?" So the outcome of all of that squatting movement was, in the end, the local borough had to buy all the empty houses, and then they sold them at a good price to all the squatters. So it was I'm not sure if I would ever do something like that again, but we felt we were on the right side of history, because the developers were preventing people from living, from having homes, and the 100,000 empty homes in London was just a huge scandal. We had at the time, we also had some fairly left-wing Trotskyites. This was now after Bloody Sunday in Ireland, and so the IRA was finding support with the International Marxist and the Fourth International Trotskyites. And so it was probably no surprise that one morning the bomb squad broke the door down. They'd had a tip that we'd been hiding members of the IRA or something. They didn't find anybody, but as our place was the center of communication, we had a payphone on the wall. The first thing the police did was break in. Of course, the police knew. They broke in, ripped the phone out of the wall, and then proceeded with their search. So those were fairly heavy left-wing days in the 70s, jumping back to the Peasants Uprising. In the end, it became a bit of a collective. And in the end, I learned as a director some fairly important points. Now, remember, I'm a Canadian in working with these British actors, and there was a considerable amount of snobbery. So, excuse me, could you please orient yourself in that direction? Oh, Guy, orient, that's not a word. The proper word is orientate. So there was constantly that kind of British snobism. But the other thing was that I had come from Europe from Germany and an experience that a director was a kind of a dictator. The British director works with actors from the inside instead of from the outside, and so I got that was a learning lesson, working carefully with those actors. Just to go back to the continental director, I don't know if you remember when the Russian hockey teams first came over in the 70s, the coach would get the visiting team's bench pushed back away from the boards so that the coach could stand in front of his players, and he would look them, Kharlamov, one of the best players in the world, he'd look him in the eye and scream at him, "Get your fucking shit together, you son of a bitch. Now get out there and skate." And so the coach was between the players who had to jump past him to get on the ice. That was the concept of a Russian coach. And that's the same concept when later on in 1989 and then 90, when I was directing at the Pushkin Theater, directing Midsummer Night's Dream in Russian, I watched some of the Russian directors direct, and they would direct with the same kind of intensity and closeness. They'd walk right up to an actor on stage and scream right into his face. And the Russian actors, just like the hockey players, nothing. You couldn't see anything in their eyes. You couldn't see anything in their face. They they would adjust their playing a little bit, but they nobody said, "Hey, shut your fucking face," or whatever. A British actor, of course, would never take that. So there I was, bringing with me a concept that director has to bring a vision, and I still believe that the director has to have responsibility of a vision, but the British actors pushed back, and when I got back to Canada, I like to think of myself as an actor's director, really working from the inside and working with the actors. And so someone like Jean Archambault in Balkanville, or Michael Hogan in numerous plays, we had a language. I would just have to say a word, 2 words. They would take it metaphorically, and that would open something up in them. Jean Archambault and I had a great complicité. We knew what each other was thinking in the most wonderful way. If you remember, he played Thibault in Balkanville. He was also in Nothing to Lose. Anyway, so to me, that production of Will What, If Not What Will. I don't know if you can see it here. This is the published version of it. It's actually a really fucking ace play, and it sets the tone for why in 1381 there was the need for a revolt, and it all had to do with serfdom and taxes and exploitation. I did the research for this. I found the songs that are in here in the British Museum. I wrote a couple of the scenes in it, and it was the style. That style is what I was aiming for. We had puppet horses, and also that I was aiming for in Fight On. And if anybody saw the workshop of part 1, you will know what I'm talking about. It was the ultimate in Brechtian epic theater, where the imagination is what is the important thing, and not the realism that's on stage. It was a huge critical success. Unfortunately, we couldn't. John Mortimer in the Sunday Observer actually wrote, it's one of the best things I've ever seen in my term as a critic. Now, what was interesting is it didn't do anything for my concept of community theater. The people who were coming to see the show were all coming to the West End, driving down, let's go slum it in the East End of London and see some left-wing theater, and isn't this all very jolly? It had nothing to do with bringing in or working with the community. It was the West End punters coming down to this dilapidated synagogue to get a frisson of left-wing politics. Now, so that was where that was on that show, and since then I've tried to understand it at the at the Infinite Theatre, unfortunately, our budgets do not and have not permitted me the kind of rehearsal time where I would like to take more time to work with the actors. I mean, I think the sonnets that we did with the masks is a case in point. We had to fast forward the rehearsals of that. I don't think it was a happy experience, not for me or the actors, even though the result was surprising. Our budget gave us 2 weeks to rehearse it, which we extended over 3 by working half days. But that was the first thing. The second thing, now here I have this dream of a theater, a left-wing theater for Tower Hamlets, for the East. Tower Hamlets was the borough we were in, the district we were in, the borough we were in. And of course, it's right next to the Tower of London. It's the very first East borough to the east of the Tower of London, it had a very strong representation through history. In the 30s, there was a very strong left-wing working class energy in the area, and the current the mayor wasn't a communist, but he was left wing, and so we, by saying what we wanted to do, we started to make friends, even if we weren't bringing in the doing it for the people that we thought we wanted to do it for. We had a couple of other hits. The Mother, Brecht's adaptation of a Gorky novel, it transferred to the Roundhouse. I didn't direct that. There was a play called Sean O'Casey's The Silver Tassie, an absolutely fabulous, great anti-war play that is basically not performed anymore. It's set in the First World War. I did a couple of things. So I look in the area. There was a professor from Ruskin College, which is the left-wing college of Oxford. He was living, and he had a Hull docker, Dave Marsden, who had done research on a 1916 school strike. So by this time, I was starting to make inroads with some of the younger local writers. So Billy Colville adapted this book as a play. It's a play set in 1916 during the war. The kids in school basically went on strike. They wanted paid for the monitors. They wanted time off to work the harvests. They didn't like the strict, the strap and the cane and so on. So it became a nationwide school strike of 10 to 14-year-olds. And that was because the kids selling the newspapers at the time were all 10 to 14 years old, hey, read all about it. Anyway, they were reading the front page news, school strike in Wales. So then the kids in East London say, hey, let's do it too. So there are historians who say that the kids at that time invented the flying pickets, which is a picket that goes from one school to the next school and closes it down and so on. And so I had to audition. We had our actors, 6 of them, and 6 boys in a boys class. And I had to audition these 12, 13, 14-year-old kids to be in the play. It was a really lovely, very low-key, but exciting. It was called Fall In and Follow Me, which is a music hall song at the time. And now 14-year-old kids, 10, 12, 14-year-old kids, they need, legally, you need to have a monitor, you need to have, separate dressing rooms. And so, I mean, all the things we did not have. So the local welfare officer targeted us. And he knew what we were doing. He at one point said, you shouldn't be doing this. We kept on. And then on opening night, he came down with, he tried to close the show. And he sent a letter to all the parents saying, sorry, you close the show, your kids aren't being treated properly and so on. So I call in the afternoon, I call a meeting of all of the parents. And these are local, strong militant East End kids. And and we have this meeting, and I say, look, here's the situation. And one by one, they all say, nobody's going to tell me what to do with my kids. Nobody's going to tell me what my kid can or can't do. Anyway, the play went on, and again, you know, we got notice in the big newspapers and everything. And the poor guy, the welfare guy, just, you know, had to walk away humiliated. The other interesting thing of note for that particular production is that the stage manager of the show was a gentleman by the name of Michael Mackenzie. Michael, he of The Baroness and the Pig, the now Montrealer, Quebecer filmmaker, and a very clever, intelligent writer. Anyway, that was his first taste of theater, was stage managing for me this production and working with the kids. And I guess that's where he got bitten by the theater bug. One of the other things that I did, we worked with the local lawyers on a play called Spare Me a Copper, because the local police were fitting up the teenagers and trying to beat them down. And so we created a play that basically expounded the legal rights that you had when confronted by the police. We did this in conjunction with the Left Wing Legal Center, and we took it to all of the community centers. So we'd walk in, they'd be dancing, they'd stop the dancing, we'd play it in the middle of the dance floor in the round, take questions afterwards and so on, and then move on to the next community center, and they'd continue their dancing. It was a really, really neat and very practical and quite effective piece of theater. The other thing that we started doing at the time was more of a community theater project. So there were a couple of younger kids now that we had hired, and they were developing a play with another group of kids based on a true story where by the docks, the dock walls are huge, and there are communities living right next to them. And the kids, again, the young 10, 11-year-old kids would climb the walls and then hijack the Jaguars stationed there and joyride them around the docks. And then, of course, eventually the police caught them and they were taken to court. And the judge was outraged that the kids would do this. I mean, this was a Jaguar bound for export. How could you? Anyway, so we made a play out of it. Again, times are so different. It was, you know, we played it for the community with the kids. At one point, there was a breakdown and the kids decided they didn't want to rehearse anymore. And I had to drive the theater van down into the community and grab the kids literally, you know, by their belts and throw them in the back of the van and say, "You're coming to rehearsal." And of course, I'd be done nowadays, but in the end, they loved the experience. And I was actually approached. There was a kid a couple of years ago who got in touch with me. He said, "I was one of those kids that you threw into the back of the van. That was the best thing that ever happened to me." Anyway, so that was our attempt to do community theater. The other thing that I did was put building workers on the board of directors of the Half Moon, like Tommy Finn, a local Irish building worker, very radical left wing, and at that point, I mean, I still had this van, the theater van, and they'd say, "Hey, Guy, you know, come around 9 o'clock." So they're working on a big building site. Says the gaffer's off. "You come around 9 o'clock. Just back the van in. Yeah, what do you need?" So I backed the van in. The entire his gang would be throwing literally, 25 sheets of plywood, boxes of nails, and everything into the back of the van. And when I thought I had everything we needed, I'd drive around the corner. The whole gang would, leave. We'd go to the pub. Believe it or not, at 9 in the morning, the pubs were open. Anyway, I buy a round of drinks, and that's how I got the materials for our sets. That, and also we used a lot of scaffy that we just ourselves took off the building sites. So that's what it took. If you wanted to do theater, that's what you had to do. And so and of course, you know, we were living on nothing, on bacon scraps at 6p a pound, and rice from our food co-op, and lentils and so on. So I do chuckle occasionally when people look at me and say, "Oh yes, you know, you're privileged. Look at you, you're so privileged." Yes, I'm very privileged. I'm Canadian. I'm a Quebecer. We live in one of the best countries in the world. So yes, I'm very privileged, but it was my generation that started the theaters. When I came back from the Half Moon, theater was, you know, 76. By the way, what happened was I went to see a film, Duty Kravitz, in Leicester Square, and there's the Laurentians, and I went, I'm homesick. So I had to come home. At the time, I was romantically involved with Pam Brighton, this amazing working class Yorkshire woman. And she had done a couple of plays for me. And so I said, I got to go. And so I passed the theater on to her. And she, I left, they were doing a play about George Davis, who, a small-time East End crook who was fitted up by the police. George Davis is innocent. And it was, again, a fairly national campaign to try and get George Davis out of the nick, because he'd been, although he was a criminal, but the police had fitted him up so they could really send him away good time. The campaign, one of the clever campaign things that they did is, at the time there was a cricket match going on for the Ashes at Lord's cricket grounds between Britain and Australia, and members of the George Davis is Innocent campaign just climbed over the wall and basically just dug up a 2-foot square piece of grass right where the ball bounces before it hits the wicket. And they threw a bit of oil over it, and then they climbed back over the wall. That's all they did. This huge British event, the Lord's cricket match, had to was sabotaged. It was the most brilliant piece of political activism, because nobody got hurt, nobody did anything, and everybody became aware of this injustice that was being done to an East Ender. Anyway, so when I left, that's what they were doing. And I came back to Canada as what I thought was a journeyman director, having taken my knocks, both in Germany as a foreigner, in England as a colonial boy. And when I got back, of course, I lucked into, I got a very tiny Canada Council grant. Oh, by the way, sorry, I didn't mention this here. I'm going to toot my own horn, but that documentary I did that I mentioned early on, We Stand on Guard for Thee, the docudrama about the atrocities in Somalia that the Canadian Armed Board, I won a national, B'nai B'rith National Broadcasting Award for that. And I was kind of proud of that too. Anyway, so I came back. I had a small grant to cross Canada and meet people. And of course, I knew Morris Podbury at the time. So I checked in with Morris. And he, you know, I had a fistful of these great reviews. Then I went to Toronto. I met Bill Glasgow. I had a fistful of reviews. And he immediately said, I'm supposed to direct a play at Theatre Calgary, Back to Beulah by W.O. Mitchell. I don't know if anybody knows W.O. Mitchell anymore, but Who's Seen the Wind was always one of my favorite books. Anyway, so there I get to meet W.O. Mitchell in Calgary. And Bill basically said, W.O., this is the guy I want to direct your play. And if you like him, see, so I went, fistful of good reviews. Anyway, we hit it off. As it turned out, W.O. Mitchell had been at the University of Manitoba. He was exactly the same age and exactly the same time as my father. So it was kind of a serendipity, and I didn't know about. Although W.O. was from Alberta, he did study in Manitoba. So I got to direct. That was my first play back from England. It's called Back to Beulah, 4 fabulous female parts at Theatre Calgary. Now, W.O. was living in Calgary at the time. He had a bit of a rep. He, if you know who he is, he wrote Jake and the Kid for CBC Radio for years. He had Who's Seen the Wind was a huge bestseller. He was a notorious kind of character as well. He was a real crusty old Western character. But the people running Theatre Calgary at the time, of course, they were doing really stupid shit. I don't know, Two for the Seesaw and, stuff off the, Broadway or whatever. I mean, real commercial summer stock stuff. And I think the Canada Council had actually said to them, you better get your shit together and do some, Canadian plays, or else, we might not be funding you anymore. So in a moment of panic, they looked around and they grabbed W.O. and he had a play. And so they said, we'll program this. This will shut the Canada Council up. And they kept saying to me, it's not going to sell well. Everybody hates W.O. Anyway, it was a good production. I had a really good cast and was able to get to the inside of those characters. And of course, it sold out, right? So that was very much, we're talking now 76, 77. That was very much the beginning. It was part of the wave of Canadian theater becoming the fundamental ground of what we actually want to see. I mean, I know when I was passing through Montreal, I saw On the Job, right? David Fenario's first play. At the time, I didn't know I was going to be working with them. And if you remember, everybody, just the mention of a Montreal street, and people would cheer. That's how starved we were for our stories. And so there's, W.O. Back to Beulah, and suddenly Calgary flocks to it. And it has, and it's interesting. One of the places I stopped is I met the people running Blythe, the Blythe Festival in Ontario, just to the west of Stratford. And the first season they did 2 plays, and they did The Mousetrap, Agatha Christie, and they said we did that because we thought we would want to sell tickets. And then they did a play for themselves, an adaptation of an Alice Munro story, How I Met My Husband. So what happens? Mousetrap doesn't sell. Alice Munro, you can't get a ticket. It's totally sold out. So that was their experience. And that's how Blythe became this great festival of Canadian theater. Now that's all they do, right? They wouldn't be caught dead doing an Agatha Christie, but they had to learn that there was a hunger for our own theater there. Anyway, so then I was came back to Montreal after doing Back to Beulah, which, by the way, transferred to the Tarragon, had already been part of the Tarragon's season. So I got to know Bill Glasgow a little bit better. Bill is a transplanted Montrealer in Toronto. He is, justly considered the father of, Canadian playwrights in many ways, and the Tarragon is the center of Canadian playwriting. But he's a patrician. He's a very rich man. He was a very rich man. He's from a Quebec patrician family. Now, if you guys know Tadoussac, if you've been there, you know that it's the summer place for the people who own or used to own Quebec, and basically there's this semicircle going up the hill near the water, right on the waterfront, and your place in Quebec society is kind of decided by where your summer home is up the hill. So the least important people are at the top of the hill, and as you get closer to the center of town and the beach, you're clearly more of a central, of greater importance in Quebec society. So where was Bill Glasgow's family estate home? Right on the beach. He was, it was Labatt's money and stuff like that. So whereas with Morris Padre, I always had an affinity. We had our fights and we will continue to have our fights. With Bill Glasgow, I could never twig the guy at all. He was in a class that I, and I think he thought I was a bit of a peasant anyway. So that comes into play later on in the hijacking of the Canadian stage, but Morris and I, by the way, what Morris is doing in South Africa, if you don't know what he's doing, you should check into it. His community center that he's investing his time and raising a lot of money for in South Africa, this multiracial open community center, but essentially trying to build a theater and promote Black theater in South Africa. It's incredible what he's doing. He deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. There will be moments when I won't speak quite so kindly of him, but I really, really think that what he's done is amazing. And I understand he's going to move back to Montreal soon. So Back to Beaulieu was the first. When I came back to Montreal, having directed back to Beaulieu, there was I pushed a play on Morris, basically a concept for a play about Les Canadiens, and to use the Montreal hockey team as a kind of metaphor for Quebec nationalism. So I pitched this to him, and Morris was watching a baseball game, and I just said, you know what, there's this, and it's all about Quebec nationalism when we use the Montreal Canadiens, as the metaphor. And he was watching the hockey game, and I remember he just sort of looked over and said, that's a good idea, go find a writer. And then he went right, and not a hockey game, he was watching the baseball game. He said, yeah, that's a good writer. Yeah, go find a writer, that's a good play. So that was it. That was our understanding of me directing for a play for him and developing a play for him. It was just done in 2 seconds while he was watching a baseball game. Now, what happened, it wasn't, in the end, Les Canadiens was not the play, because that happened then in 77. That was not the first play that I directed. What happened was, after On the Job, David Calderisi, who had directed On the Job, David Fenario's first play, he and David had a falling out. And suddenly there I was, and, this young, groovy left-wing guy. And so David agreed that I could direct his second play, Nothing to Lose. So suddenly I actually have a play to direct before the Les Canadiens. And David and I share many things in terms of our political outlook on things, but there are many things that we don't share. But Nothing to Lose was a pretty dynamic play. It's a play about a garments, a strike in a factory across the road from a pub. So it's all set in the old-fashioned tavern that only men are allowed in on, and it has Shibugamu, Jean Archambault, who sits in the corner, drinks, and has the philosophy of the place. And then there are the guys who come in saying, we got to go on strike. And it's a play where David writes in a nice sort of way. He gets the French and the English sort of working together to try and take on the management. Peter McNeill, who grew up in Verdun, was perfect casting for the lead role, Johnny, and Jean Archambault, as I said, we found serendipitously, and he played this character that morphed into Thibault in Balkanville in a certain way. Jean-Guy Bouchard, I think, played Groga, the French leader of the Union. Anyway, we had a good time, and it was realistic theater. It was old-fashioned realism. We set the pub up exactly, the tavern up exactly the way a tavern looks. And we had a very tactile, good, quiet relationship. Peter McNeill had to drink something like 15 beers during the course of the show. So he actually had to take a piss retardant pill at the beginning of the show to make sure he didn't have to run out and go to the bathroom in the middle of the show, because he just sat there drinking one beer after the other. And of course, I insisted that it looked like real beer. So it was water, but it did have real beer in it. So it actually had foam on it, and you could you can tell when there's fake beer on stage, and I didn't like that. And my big wish that I never got with Nothing to Lose was I wanted the clock on the wall. It was a Molson clock, and the play itself, it was one act, and it was like 90 minutes or something, but the action it was over 6 hours or something like that. So I wanted the technicians to change the speed of the clock so that it could move, and you think you had lived 6 hours, even though you'd only lived in an hour and a half. It was those crazy little battles that you have as a director. The technicians were never able to do that. Everybody thought, what a great idea, and they kept trying to figure it out, but we couldn't get the clock to move according to the stage time. So it really bugged me that that it only went an hour and a half. And then in the end, what we decided was, we broke it, and we just put time doesn't matter here. We put an X through it or something like that. Anyway, speaking of X through it, the King of Canada is reassessing history. We're trying to deal with past leaders who, in current value systems, don't live up to our the best practices. And I mean, I think we're all sort of guilty of that. I mean, can you imagine there was a time when I chain smoked cigars in rehearsal? I mean, I went from cigarettes to cigars, and I would chain smoke these little cigars in rehearsal. And I mean, what were we thinking? I can remember Susan Hogan during one of the rehearsals for Sharon Pollock's play Doc. She would come up like this to the director's desk and say, "Excuse me, Guy, can I ask a question?" I mean, what were we getting away with? Poisoning ourselves and everybody in the room. So, there are a lot of things that when you reverse judge history, and I think Ken Stetson has something to say about that. We judge ourselves. But my point being is that when Brecht and his company, after the war, were given control of the Theater am Schiffbauer Damm, that's where the Berliner Ensemble plays, he walks in, and they're still up on the lodges. They're still the coat of arms of the Prussian nobility up there everywhere. And of course, they're all good socialists, and they say, "All right, let's rip it down." And Brecht says, "Wait." And all he does, and it's still there to this day, he just gets the technician to climb up on a ladder and paint a red cross through the Prussian coat of arms. He said, we have to be reminded of our history, but we have to also know that we're in control. So I make that comment after our production of King of Canada, where we are trying to understand and judge the longest serving prime minister. And how do you judge? How do you make those judgments? I love the speech of Paul's at the end, where King turns to us and says, "If you judge me, you're judging yourself." And there's something in there about that. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't be judging ourselves, but and then we shouldn't be making things better. All right, I'm sort of just at the beginning of back in Canada and freelancing. I think the next story probably coming up is actually no, Paper Wheat is before Balkanville. So then I get a call from out west Saskatchewan. Do I want to do direct the national tour of Paper Wheat? So I've now got this rep as this left wing, whatever. And Paper Wheat is, of course, actually this speaks into the thing of history and re-understanding history. But do I want to direct the national tour of Paper Wheat? And of course I do. It's this play about the co-ops and the collectivization on the prairies and fighting, Cargill and fighting big business. And it's all about the settlers plowing the land and so on. So I go out. Now, the first thing is in the initial production, now I'm dumping on them here a little, but it was all white bread actors, okay? The story of the West, of course, you can't get around the huge, Ukrainian and immigrant population who actually were lured to the West. Okay, at the same time as we were shoving the extra population in Quebec, the Francophone population, into Vermont and into northern New York, and getting them out of Canada, we were enticing Eastern Europeans to come and take the West. Can you imagine what would have happened if those Francophones, instead of going to Vermont, had gone and settled the West? So anyway, it's a piece of Canadian history that one can consider what this country would be like if, in fact, the English Anglo powers hadn't played this power game. Anyway, so they're inviting, but the initial cast of Paper Wheat didn't have any Ukrainians or any immigrants or anything. So I say, no, we're going to change the story. We're going to change the cast. First of all, find me the best goddamn Ukrainian fiddler in Saskatchewan, which they do, Bill Prokopchuk. And then I say, I look around for a Ukrainian actor. Somebody says Lubomir Mikachuk. Now, Lubo is actually a Montrealer. He ended up being in Nothing to Lose after as well. So here this is Paper Wheat. Now this gentleman here is David Francis, who was part of that national tour. And I didn't know David, but my partner and then wife at the time, Pam Brighton, did. So I just phoned David Francis. He was working in England. He was homesick too. And I said, David, I'm doing this collective called Paper Wheat. You want to come and be in it? He said, sure. I didn't even know him. So, and of course, he's a Quebecer and one of our great Montreal actors, not in having difficulty with health at the moment. I hope you can fight that battle, David. But yes, so we did the national tour of Paper Wheat. There was, Ukrainian and Latvian and all sorts of communities that we represented. Can you imagine that we actually had a period where we could do a play, Paper Wheat, and not acknowledge that some of the settlers were Ukrainian? Now, here's the other thing. This play, which became a hit, we toured it nationally, we toured the province of Saskatchewan, not a mention of the First Nations, okay? 77, and we're writing the history of the opening of the West, and we don't even have anything about the fact that the settlers were grabbing the land through lies and broken treaties and essentially, leaning and pushing and so on from the people who were living there. Anyway, I'm confessing my own ignorance at the time, and but Paper Wheat, huge hit. We did it at the Centaur. We even did it a couple of times down in the Eastern Townships. We did it everywhere. And I made a couple of good, strong relationships, David Francis and Lubo and so on. And Bill Prokopchuk, the most amazing fiddler, provided the incidental music. He had been to Nashville. He was this famous in the Ukrainian community. He was this great famous fiddle player, and we got him to tour with us. And he didn't understand theater. He didn't know what the heck he was doing. He was one of those musicians. He couldn't read a note of music. He knew he could play anything, and there it was. Anyway, that's it.